The torches burned low in the corridors of Whitehall Palace, their flickering glow casting monstrous shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the moon hung red and swollen, an omen in the night sky. It was September in a country barely recovered from religious slaughter and dynastic treason. A new storm was gathering. But this time, it would not be fought with armies or priests. This time, the weapon was love, or what passed for it in the bedchambers of royalty. The Queen of England sat alone, her face pale beneath a mask of white lead and crimson rouge. Elizabeth Tudor was 27 years old, and already she ruled with the cunning of a seasoned warlord. But even the Virgin Queen had one vulnerability, and it had a name: Robert Dudley. He was her childhood companion, the only man who dared speak to her with something like equality. Tall, lean, and roguishly handsome, Dudley was the son of the executed Duke of Northumberland, a traitor who tried to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Robert had survived that purge, not by loyalty, but by charm and cruelty. At court, he moved like a wolf among lambs, and the Queen could not stop watching him. But there was a problem. Dudley had a wife. Amy Robsart, his bride of 10 years, had lived a secluded life far from court. While her husband basked in the Queen's favor, rising swiftly through the ranks, appointed Master of the Horse, and a constant figure at Elizabeth's side, Amy was left to rot in rural obscurity. Some said she was ill, others whispered of madness, but few doubted that she was in the way. On that crimson-tinged morning, a servant entered the parlor at Cumnor Place, the house where Amy was staying. What he found would change the fate of a nation. She was lying at the foot of a staircase. Her neck was broken cleanly. There were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no suicide note, just a lifeless body, and a staircase that would forever become one of English history's most notorious symbols. At court, the whispers began at once. She threw herself down, said some. She was pushed, said others. But the most chilling murmurs carried one name in trembling breath: Elizabeth. Had the Queen, who had sworn never to marry, ordered the death of a wife so she could make her beloved Dudley a king? As bells tolled in mourning across Oxfordshire, the wheels of suspicion began to turn. It wasn't just about a woman's death. It was about the soul of a monarch, the boundaries of lust, and the cold calculations behind velvet drapes. And it was only the beginning. When Elizabeth Tudor ascended the throne in 1558, England was a kingdom bleeding from its own veins. Her sister Mary I, Bloody Mary, had left behind a trail of executions, Catholic terror, and national disgrace. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was seen by many as illegitimate, the product of lust and beheading. To rule as a woman in such a world required not just strength, but an illusion of sanctity. So Elizabeth crafted her identity with deliberate, brutal care. She became the Virgin Queen, married not to man but to her kingdom. Her chastity was not just a virtue, it was a weapon. But behind the glittering performance was a dangerous truth. From the very beginning, one man was always near her, closer than any minister or general: Robert Dudley. They had known each other since childhood, both imprisoned in the Tower during Mary's reign. They had stared death in the face together, and that kind of terror bonds people beyond reason. When Elizabeth became queen, Dudley was the first man she elevated. She made him Master of the Horse, responsible for her personal transport, always by her side, always within reach. The court noticed quickly, too quickly. They dined late into the night. He whispered in her ear during council meetings. He rode beside her in processions. His chambers were too close to hers. Ambassadors from Spain and France wrote scandalized reports back to their monarchs. The Queen is in love, she is possessed. But this wasn't a tale of tender romance. It was a collision of ambition, trauma, and toxic desire. Elizabeth, orphaned by her mother's execution and tormented by a lifetime of betrayal, had learned to trust no one. Yet she clung to Dudley with a desperation that frightened her advisors. There was a catch, though, a flaw in the dream. Robert Dudley was married. Amy Robsart had been wed to him in the bloom of youth, when he was merely a nobleman's son. Their union had been political, but not unkind. Amy had beauty and money, but no place in the brutal theatre of royal ambition. As Dudley rose in Elizabeth's orbit, Amy became a shadow, a nuisance, a problem to be solved. By 1559, Dudley stopped visiting her entirely. He remained at court, bathed in royal favor. Elizabeth refused all foreign suitors, angering her council, and the rumors became more vile, that Elizabeth wanted Amy dead, that the Queen practiced black magic, that Dudley had sold his soul for a crown. And then, Amy died. A broken neck, a lonely staircase. No witnesses. Elizabeth claimed shock. Dudley called for an inquest, but England reeled. What had begun as court gossip now reeked of regicide. Elizabeth's reign, barely 2 years old, was already dripping with scandal. She did not attend Amy's funeral. Dudley was forbidden from marrying the Queen. And yet, the two remained inseparable. What kind of love survives the death of a spouse under suspicious circumstances? What kind of queen allows it? Only one forged by blood, betrayal, and a hunger for control. Cumnor Place was not a home. It was a prison made of wood and silence. Isolated in the Oxfordshire countryside, surrounded by whispers but devoid of witnesses, Amy Robsart Dudley spent her final days like a ghost. She was 30 years old, childless, and already discarded. The letters she sent to her husband went unanswered. The servants noticed her moods growing dark. She was sick, they said, frail, fading. Some whispered of cancer, others of melancholy. But Amy was not just ill, she was terrified. Days before her death, she reportedly insisted that her household attend a fair without her. She wanted the house empty, or she wanted them safe. On September 8, 1560, she was found at the bottom of a staircase. Her neck snapped, her body strangely intact. There were no bruises, no blood, no defensive wounds. The stairs were shallow and few, too slight for a fall to cause instant death. The coroner's report labeled it an accident, but that word echoed like a lie across every stone hall in England. Some suggested suicide, but Amy was a devout Protestant. Suicide meant damnation. Others claimed she had been pushed, or that the fall had been staged after poison or strangulation. One servant claimed that the Queen's agents had visited Cumnor just days prior. Another vanished without a trace before he could testify. Robert Dudley demanded an inquest, but not to clear his name. His ambition hung in the balance. If he could not marry Elizabeth now, he would be nothing. The inquiry dragged on for months, clouded in secrecy. The coroner, Richard Smith, gave a verdict that seemed carefully worded to avoid blame. Misfortune, that was all. A misfortune. But even as the ink dried on that report, the court reeled with suspicion. The nobility recoiled from Dudley. They would not support his marriage to the Queen. Foreign dignitaries scoffed. The Spanish ambassador wrote, "If the Queen marries him, she will be worthy of the gallows." Elizabeth, ever calculating, did not abandon Dudley. She distanced herself politically but kept him close emotionally. Her reputation as the Virgin Queen would not be tainted by a marriage to a suspected wife-killer. Yet she never stopped favoring him, never stopped summoning him to her chambers, never stopped defending him in whispers behind her fan. Amy Robsart was buried quietly, without pomp. Not even her husband attended the funeral. And as the dirt closed over her casket, the nation realized something chilling. The Queen's heart was not untouched by death. It was fed by it. She had chosen her path, not of love, not of marriage, but of power, smeared with scandal and sealed with silence. Amy's tombstone bears no inscription of justice, only her name and the date of her fall. But history remembers the echo of her last fatal steps. The death of Amy Robsart should have ended the affair. It should have shattered the illusion, driven Robert Dudley from court, and forced Elizabeth into a more politically convenient marriage. But it did not. Instead, something far more dangerous happened. Elizabeth drew Dudley even closer. Against every warning from her advisors, she continued to see him daily. She named him to more offices, gifted him wealth and titles. In 1564, she made him Earl of Leicester, a title that granted him not just power, but permanence in the tapestry of nobility. This was not love in its purest form. It was love twisted into obsession, poisoned by guilt and secrecy. Dudley was the only man who knew her darkest doubts about her body, her crown, her mother's beheading. He comforted her, manipulated her, and seduced her with the intimacy of shared trauma. And she, in return, let him touch what no other man was allowed to reach her trust. But the court could not bear it. Elizabeth's ministers, especially William Cecil, raged in private. Cecil believed Dudley was corrupt, arrogant, and dangerous. Worse, he feared what the people believed, that the Queen had colluded in murder to keep a man. Parliament pressured her to marry. Foreign monarchs sent suitors, princes, dukes, kings in waiting. But Elizabeth, always circling the idea of union, never accepted. Why should she? She had Dudley. Whispers turned into diplomatic threats. Spain's ambassador warned that any marriage between Elizabeth and Dudley would be considered an insult, a criminal alliance with a suspected murderer. France laughed behind lace sleeves. Scotland began to stir. Inside the court, the nobles grew bold in their disgust. They sabotaged Dudley's proposals. They fed rumors to ambassadors. One noble even suggested he would rather see the Queen dead than with Leicester on the throne. Elizabeth responded, the only way she could, with duplicity. She assured Parliament she would consider other suitors. She flirted with the Duke of Anjou. She encouraged Cecil's plans for foreign diplomacy. But at night, behind closed doors, she continued to meet Dudley in secret. He remained her companion on royal progresses, her shadow at state banquets, her partner in masques and dances. It was said that Elizabeth never looked at another man the way she looked at him. But that gaze, intimate, possessive, was a curse. For Elizabeth would never allow herself to fully surrender to love, and she would never allow Robert Dudley to belong to anyone else. She could not marry him, but she would not let him go. It was a perfect stalemate. And in its cruel tension, the Queen began to unravel.
How do you punish the man you love when his very existence threatens your reign?
You keep him close, close enough to watch, close enough to wound. By the late 1560s, Whitehall had become a place of velvet shadows and whispered blasphemies. The Queen's court was not only a political hive, it had become the epicenter of strange rites and darker suspicions. With Robert Dudley still bound to her side, but forever beyond the altar, Elizabeth's reign began to twist into something more theatrical and more dangerous. Rumors of sorcery were not uncommon in Tudor England, but they clung to Elizabeth and Dudley with unusual fervor. Foreign ambassadors claimed the pair used black magic to maintain their unnatural bond. Priests whispered that Dudley was possessed, or worse, a warlock who had ensnared the Queen's soul. These were not merely superstitions, they were tactical whispers, weaponized slander designed to undermine the monarchy. But they worked, because even those within the palace began to believe them. Why else would Elizabeth keep a man who brought scandal to her name, whose very presence endangered the legitimacy of her throne? Why else would she reject powerful marriage alliances in favor of a disgraced suitor? Why else, unless they were bound by something darker than love? There were reports, never confirmed, always denied, of alchemists visiting court at odd hours, summoned by Dudley himself. A strange Italian named Cornelius was seen entering the royal apartments carrying books bound in human skin, jars of blood, and amulets engraved with Hebrew spells. It was said he helped Elizabeth concoct potions to preserve her beauty and charms to keep Dudley loyal. Others claimed the Queen's astrologer, John Dee, was more than a stargazer. He and Dudley reportedly convened in secret chambers, performing invocations to bend fate itself to create an heir from barren flesh. For Elizabeth was obsessed with one thing beyond Dudley: legacy. She could not bear a child without marriage. She would not marry, And yet she desperately wanted a son, one born not of diplomacy but of her body and Robert Dudley's blood. Some said they tried, some said they succeeded, and the child was taken, hidden, or killed. There is no record of a pregnancy, only whispers, only silences. But one letter, intercepted and suppressed by Cecil, survives in fragments. Written in Dudley's hand, it reads, "She bleeds, and the moon has passed. I fear the potion worked too well." The court called them the moon lovers, bound by tides, touched by madness. Behind locked doors, Elizabeth and Dudley lived a life beyond comprehension to their subjects, a passion denied by the altar, fed by grief, and perhaps by ritual. Whether they believed in sorcery or merely used it as a metaphor for obsession, no one can say. But something unnatural thrived in their intimacy. A love too poisonous to touch daylight. A craving that infected statecraft, twisted ambition, and damned them both to loneliness. The Star Chamber, the Queen's private council of judgment, began investigating rumors of treason, seduction, and unnatural acts. Yet every inquiry hit a dead end. Witnesses vanished. Servants changed stories. The Queen herself denied nothing and admitted nothing. She didn't need to. Her power was absolute. Her gaze could freeze a man's blood, and Robert Dudley, for all his secrets, remained exactly where she wanted him. At her side, always. In 1570, as England's enemies circled like wolves, Queen Elizabeth faced the gravest crisis of her reign. The Pope had excommunicated her. Catholic Europe prepared for war. Her ministers begged her to take a foreign husband to cement an alliance. The Spanish king offered his nephew. The French sent the Duc d'Alençon. Scotland threatened rebellion if she remained unwed. But Elizabeth, stoic, painted, and defiant, refused them all. She had already given her heart to Robert Dudley, and he betrayed her. At 40, Dudley was aging out of favor. The Queen's passion, though enduring, had curdled into something brittle and cruel. She kept him close, but increasingly humiliated him. She flirted openly with other men in court masks. She reminded him, again and again, that he was a subject, her subject, and so Dudley did the unthinkable. He secretly married a young noblewoman, Lettice Knollys, Elizabeth's cousin. Lettice was beautiful, red-haired and 20 years younger than Dudley. Some said she looked like a younger version of Elizabeth herself, an eerie, deliberate echo. Dudley kept the marriage hidden, knowing the Queen's wrath would be biblical. But secrets do not last in palaces. When Elizabeth discovered the betrayal, her fury was unlike anything the court had seen. She slapped Lettice across the face before the entire court and hissed, "As but one sun lights the sky, so shall I be Queen of England and no other woman." Lettice was banished for life from court. Dudley, humiliated, groveling, was temporarily exiled. But Elizabeth could not bring herself to destroy him completely. She stripped him of certain honors, but later restored them. She refused to look at him for months, but then summoned him to dance at Christmas. This was no longer love. It was domination, a cruel cycle of rejection and reward. She could not marry him. She would not allow anyone else to have him. Elizabeth became more jealous, more possessive. When other women glanced at Dudley, they were punished. One maid was dismissed for a smile. Another was rumored to have died mysteriously after being seen near his chambers. Ambassadors from Spain wrote of the Queen's mad passions. One letter from the Spanish court describes her as bewitched by Leicester, but possessed of a man's hatred when scorned. The scandal grew grotesque when the Queen began commissioning portraits of herself crushing serpents, her foot on the head of a crowned woman with red hair, a thinly veiled image of Lettice. But if Elizabeth was cursed by jealousy, Dudley had inherited a darker doom, the slow, agonizing collapse of his power. His secret marriage cost him his greatest weapon, the Queen's desire, and replaced it with something more venomous. He remained at court, but not in her heart. He had wounded the only woman who ever loved him with a force greater than ambition. And from that day forward, no kiss he gave, no oath he swore, would ever be trusted again. After the betrayal, Elizabeth could have destroyed Robert Dudley with a single word. She could have stripped his lands, his titles, even his life. But she did not. She did something worse. She kept him alive and let him rot under the weight of her cold affection. Dudley returned to court a broken man. His eyes were darker, his shoulders hunched slightly beneath the embroidered velvet. The Queen allowed him to stand near her at feasts, to serve in Parliament, even to command troops. But the intimacy was gone. Her private glances no longer held warmth, only calculation. To those at court, it became clear Elizabeth had chosen to punish him with proximity. Lettice Knollys, now Countess of Leicester, was barred from court indefinitely. She lived in banishment at Kenilworth Castle, Dudley's estate, a castle that had once been a gift from the Queen herself. Elizabeth never forgave her. She referred to her mockingly as the she-wolf and refused even to hear her name spoken. When Dudley begged for Lettice's return to favor, Elizabeth turned to him with a frozen smile and said, "You had a wife before. You remember how that ended." Dudley's political influence waned. He was often passed over for military command, second-guessed by Cecil, and ignored in foreign policy. He served loyally in the Netherlands, but even his battlefield victories could not restore what he had lost. The full confidence of the Queen's heart. But still she summoned him. Still she leaned on him in private. Still she allowed him to whisper in her ear during state banquets. This half-love, half-hatred drove him to desperation. He began hosting lavish entertainments in Elizabeth's honor, masks, tournaments, fireworks that lit the sky for hours, all in a pathetic attempt to resurrect her affection. But Elizabeth, though intrigued, never softened. She had tasted betrayal. Now she fed on control. Dudley's public humiliation became court spectacle. When Elizabeth gave him a gift of a jeweled sword, it was engraved not with praise, but a Latin motto, meaning power without loyalty is emptiness. Even his body began to fail. He aged prematurely, plagued by headaches, insomnia, and rumors of syphilis. He wore cosmetics to hide his decay. But the Queen saw through the mask. She never let him forget. "You could have been king," she once whispered to him in front of a Venetian ambassador. "Now you are only my servant." And still, he stayed. What kind of man remains loyal to a woman who mocks his fall? What kind of queen tortures a man with the love she denies and the punishment she refuses to end? One answer echoed in court corridors. They were the same kind of monster, reflected in each other's eyes. By the late 1580s, the royal court had aged. The faces were older, the intrigues more poisonous, and the Queen more alone. But still Robert Dudley lingered, neither lover nor husband, neither traitor nor favorite. He remained in orbit, held there by Elizabeth's gravitational cruelty. And then came the boy, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. Dudley's stepson, perhaps even his illegitimate son, arrived at court a golden-haired tempest, full of reckless charm and ambition. He quickly captured the Queen's attention. He was young, beautiful, and bold. A new Dudley, but one without the scars. Elizabeth was nearly 60, Essex was 20. It was a dangerous echo of the past. Dudley saw it immediately. The boy was everything he once was, flirtatious, daring, ambitious, willing to bend rules and hearts alike. But unlike Dudley, Essex had no loyalty. He did not love the Queen. He used her. Jealousy twisted Dudley's final years. He watched as Essex danced with Elizabeth at court, laughed with her behind closed doors, and received the gifts and glances that once belonged to him. And yet he dared not speak against it. He had already played his cards. There was no winning this time. But something dark began to creep into the Queen's court once more. Essex fell ill. Repeatedly, he complained of stomach pain, of hallucinations, of black bile. Physicians were summoned, potions prescribed. None of it worked. Whispers began to surface. He had been poisoned. And one name surfaced again and again: Robert Dudley. Theories abounded that Dudley, desperate to reclaim his place, had poisoned the boy out of vengeance, that he resented Essex's presence, resented that the Queen might give him what Dudley had been denied, her legacy. Another theory was more chilling still, that it was Elizabeth herself who ordered the poison, afraid Essex would betray her like Dudley once had. Neither accusation was proven, but the truth may have been more horrifying. Dudley and Elizabeth both wanted him gone. The boy was a mirror, reflecting their faded youth, their failures, their decay. He was a threat, not just to their power, but to the illusion of love they had both preserved, like a shrine. And then, in 1588, just months after Essex recovered, Robert Dudley died. Suddenly, quietly. Some said it was natural. Others said it was the final act of the curse they had woven together. In his chambers, a letter was found, his final words to Elizabeth, sent only days before. The Queen read it and did not speak for hours. She ordered it placed in a locked box beside her bed. She would keep it there until the day she died. Essex, now unopposed, rose quickly, and soon he too would fall. The poisoned prince was merely the next in line for heartbreak, betrayal, and ruin, just like Dudley. Kenilworth Castle had once been a gift, Dudley's grand gesture of devotion to Elizabeth. It was not merely a residence, it was a theater of seduction, built stone by stone for one purpose, to make a queen feel like a goddess. There, in 1575, Dudley had staged the most extravagant royal entertainment England had ever seen. 17 days of masks, music, fireworks, and pageants. A mechanical dolphin swam in the lake. A floating island carried singing nymphs. Entire forests were built, only to be set ablaze in mock battles. It cost him a fortune, and yet Elizabeth did not marry him. She left, smiling but unmoved. Years later, long after the betrayal and the poisonings, after the bitter silences and hollow dances at court, Elizabeth returned to Kenilworth. Dudley was dead. The castle was empty, its tapestries moth-eaten, its halls echoing with the ghosts of laughter and longing. The Queen wandered the grounds alone. Witnesses said she wore black, not her usual ivory or crimson, and spoke to no one for hours. The once proud fountains were dry. The rooms that had once echoed with music were now hushed crypts of memory. She lingered in the great hall, where Dudley had once knelt before her with a golden rose. And there, at the center of that long, cold room, she wept. It was said that she ordered the musicians to play just once more, the same lute ballad Dudley had commissioned for her. And when the notes filled the dusty air, she did not smile. She sat unmoving, eyes hollow, lips trembling. Perhaps she saw Amy's broken body at the base of the stairs. Perhaps she saw the face of Lettice Knollys, twisted in terror. Perhaps she saw Dudley as he was in the end, sick, bitter, grey with shame. Or perhaps she saw herself young, laughing, believing that power and passion could share a bed. But now, there was no laughter, only dust and ghosts. Kenilworth was no longer a monument to love. It was a tomb, a place where lust, ambition, and betrayal had danced themselves to death. After that visit, Elizabeth never returned. She spoke of Dudley occasionally, always with a hint of cruelty, always with an undertone of longing. But the Queen, who had once ruled men's hearts with a glance, now found herself surrounded by silence. Her favorite was dead, her enemies were rising, her body was failing. The dance was over. All that remained was one letter, and the memory of a man she could never truly claim, yet never truly let go. It was autumn when they found her, alone in her chambers, weeping silently beside a small, worn box. Inside, among faded silks and personal relics, was a single folded piece of parchment. The ink was smudged, but the words were unmistakable. It was Robert Dudley's last letter to her. He had written it in September 1588, just days before his sudden death at Cornbury. The handwriting was shaky, the message simple. "I do thank your Majesty for your great kindness. I kiss your hand and shall pray for you with all my heart. Yours most faithfully and obediently, R. Leicester." Elizabeth read it over and over again. She never spoke of its contents publicly, but she kept it with her, always beside her bed, within reach, as if the man himself might return if she stared long enough into the ink. She called it his last farewell, but it was not farewell she feared. It was absence. She had loved him, there was no denying it now. Not with her hair turned white and her hands trembling from age. Not with Dudley buried in the ground and her youth burned away by politics and pretense. But she had never allowed herself to say the word love. Not allowed. Not even to him. Instead, she wore her pain like armor. As her health declined, she grew increasingly erratic, refusing to eat, refusing to sleep in a bed. She spent her nights seated on cushions on the floor, surrounded by flickering candles, her back bowed beneath the weight of invisible grief. The letter was always nearby. Ambassadors reported that she spoke to herself in fragments. One phrase repeated, "I killed him," whether she meant Dudley, Amy, or something far more spiritual, the death of her own capacity to love. None could say. Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, the monarch who had outmaneuvered popes, kings, and assassins, died in 1603 without naming a successor, without a husband, and without a child. She left behind an empire, but no one to grieve her honestly. At her funeral, Robert Dudley's stepson, the Earl of Essex, long since executed for treason, was also absent, destroyed by the same icy grip that had once held Dudley close. The great loves of her life had all died violently, or alone, and she died surrounded by jewels, titles, and pages, but not a single soul she truly trusted. Historians have tried to sanitize the story. They say it was courtly love, that Dudley and Elizabeth were close companions, that theirs was a bond forged in mutual respect and political necessity. But beneath the tapestries and powdered masks, the truth remains. It was a story of obsession, of lust shackled by power, of a queen who could not love without destroying, and a man who could not be loved without betraying. The Wolf Queen of the North never married, but she never needed to. She ruled through hunger, through denial, through the blood she never spilled with her own hand, but always caused to flow. And at the center of it all was a staircase, a broken neck, and a letter folded in silence. The final whisper of a man whose love was never enough, and a woman who made the whole world believe that was by design.